To set the scene for Nostradamus, I'm going to read 4 pages from Dr. Edward Edinger's The Aion Lectures in order to give you a little context of what Dr. Jung was saying. Remember that late in his career, when he was writing Aion, Dr. Jung was not going back to explain where he was coming from. And so if you didn't know what his ideas were, then you could be simply left behind. And so Dr. Edward Edinger, in the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, left us 16 valuable books that interpret Carl Jung. So this is the beginning of Dr. Edinger's commentary or lecture on chapter 7 of Aion. The Prophecies of Nostradamus. Jung sets the scene for his discussion of Nostradamus with the first paragraph of chapter 7, a concise summarizing statement. Quote, "The course of our religious history, as well as an essential part of our psychic development, could have been predicted more or less accurately, both as regards time and content, from the precession of the equinoxes through the constellation of Pisces. The prediction, as we saw, was actually made and coincides with the fact that the Church suffered a schism in the 16th century. In other words, our nodal point of 1500. After that, an enantiodromia process set in, which, in contrast to the Gothic striving upwards to the heights, could be described as a horizontal movement outwards, namely the voyages of discovery and the conquest of nature. The vertical was cut across by the horizontal, and man's spiritual and moral development moved in a direction that grew more and more obviously anti-Christian, corresponding to the movement of the equinoctial point through the 2 fishes. First through the vertical fish, and then, starting about 1500, through the horizontal fish, so that today we are confronted with a crisis of Western civilization whose outcome appears to be exceedingly dubious." Now keep in mind that in chapter 6, Dr. Jung had talked about the sign of the fishes and about how astrology worked to influence human psychological development over the ages. Jung then turns to the astrological prophecies of Nostradamus. Jung then turns to the astrological prophecies of Nostradamus, as is evident to the readers of Aion. Jung casts his net very widely. As is evident to the readers of Aion, Jung casts his net very widely. Who would have thought Nostradamus would come into the picture? But here he is. This man, whom Jung thought was worth a chapter in Aion, lived from 1503 to 1566, so he was born right on the nodal point of 1500. His parents were French Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity on the threat of exile. Nostradamus lived a very dramatic life. Both his grandfathers were famous physicians and astrologers, a combination very common in those days, and they were in the service of the dukedom, which was equivalent to French royalty. Nostradamus was a precocious child, and his education was supervised by his grandfather, who saw that he had the best. He went to medical school at Montpellier. I'm going to pronounce it in English. My French pronunciation is very poor. He went to medical school at Montpellier and did brilliantly. He spent several years as a successful wandering physician, which was usual in those days. He developed quite a reputation for his courageous treatment of plague victims. In his early 30s, he settled down with a wife and 2 children. After a few years, the plague struck home, and his whole family was wiped out except for himself. He then had 10 years of wandering as a physician, and at 44 he married again to a rich widow. He became a court favorite and turned more and more to the writing of prophecies in verse. At first, about the coming year, then gradually he ranged farther and farther afield. His published prophecies were very popular, although they were quite obscure and not very specific. Nostradamus tells us that he only began writing, or at least publishing them, at the age of 51. He said that he had found an unaccountable and new enthusiasm springing up uncontrollably in his mind, which at last amounted almost to a maddening fever, till he sat down to write the prophecies. Nostradamus was really gripped by the activation of the unconscious. And this would be, in terms of what we've been discussing in the group, Nostradamus was having a religious experience or an experience of the self. And this is what Dr. Jung would have recognized about him and why Dr. Jung wanted to talk about him. So, Nostradamus was really gripped by the activation of the unconscious. In his preface to the Prophecies, written as a letter to his son, he says that he refrained from writing down his prophecies for a long time because people would be offended by what they heard. He quotes Christ saying, Give not that which is unholy unto dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine. But he managed his mind, and evidently the reason he did so was that maddening fever he experienced internally. But he changed his mind. And evidently the reason he did so was that maddening fever he experienced internally. He makes an interesting remark, quote, Later, because of the vulgar advent, I decided to give way, and by dark and cryptic sentences tell you the causes of the future mutation of mankind, unquote. The term vulgar advent is usually assumed by Nostradamus scholars to refer to the French Revolution, but I think the use of the term advent suggests that it might rather refer to his vision of the coming of the Antichrist. In another place he confesses, Many times in the week I am overtaken by an ecstasy. Again, he says that his calculations, quote, have been determined by the celestial movements combined with the emotion handed down to me by my forebears, which come over me at certain hours. In other words, Nostradamus would be meditating on the astrological images and patterns, and in the midst of that meditation, he would be gripped by intense emotions, which he identified with residues of his ancestors within his own makeup. In another place, Nostradamus says, quote, Hidden prophecies come to me by the subtle spirit of fire, sometimes through the understanding being disturbed in contemplating the remotest of stars while remaining alert. The pronouncements are taken down in writing without fear, without a taint of excess verbiage, because all these things proceeded from the divine power of the great eternal God. So he was absolutely convinced that his prophecies were divinely inspired. Sorry about that. I thought I was on the screen all that time. I guess I wasn't. Anyway. Now, with this background, let us look at the one particular prophecy Jung chose to quote. Quote, after detailing a year characterized, among other things, by various astrological conjunctions, he says, quote, the beginning of that year shall see a greater persecution against the Christian church than ever was in Africa, and it shall be in the year 1792, at which time everyone will think it a renovation of the age. And at that time, and in those countries, the infernal power shall rise against the church of Jesus Christ. This shall be the second Antichrist, which shall persecute the said church, and its true vicar by means of the power of temporal kings, who through their ignorance shall be seduced by tongues more sharp than any sword in the hands of a madman. The persecution of the clergy shall have its beginning in the power of the northern kings, joined by the eastern ones, and that persecution shall last 11 years, or a little less, at which time the chief northern king shall fail. Paragraph 151 of Aion. Unquote. This reference to 1792 is generally understood as referring to the French Revolution. Concerning this, Jung says, after reviewing some other facts which led to the date of 1789, both dates are suggestive, and a knowledge of subsequent events confirms that the things that happened around that time were significant forerunners of developments in our own day. The enthronement of the Déesse Raison, the goddess of reason, was in fact an anticipation of the anti-Christian trend that was pursued from then onwards. References to paragraph 155. Jung alludes to the enthronement of the goddess of reason several times and gives considerable historical importance to it as a symbolic event. The closest thing I find to this event is in Will Durant's The Age of Napoleon, in which he writes, quote, the crowd of sans-culottes, rebels, invaded the Abbey of St. Denis on October 16, 1793, emptied the coffins of French royalty there entombed, and melted the metal for use in the war. On November 10th, men and women from the working class quarters and the ideological haunts of Paris paraded through the streets in mock religious dress and procession. They entered the hall of the convention and prevailed upon the deputies to pledge attendance at the evening's fete at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, renamed the Temple of Reason. There, a new sanctuary had been arranged in which Mademoiselle Candale of the opera, robed in a tricolor flag and crowned with a red cap, stood as the goddess of liberty. I guess that would be the equivalent of the goddess of reason. Attended by persuasive ladies who sang a hymn to liberty. The worshippers danced and sang in the naves, while in the side chapels, said hostile reporters, profiteers of freedom celebrated the rights of love. In other words, they copulated. On November 17th, the Bishop of Paris, yielding to popular demand, appeared before the convention, abjured his office, handed over to the president his episcopal crozier and ring, and donned the red cap of freedom. On November 23rd, the Commune ordered all Christian churches in Paris closed. Unquote. That shows you what was going on in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, renamed the Temple of renamed the Temple of the Goddess of Reason. Jung expands on this issue in his essay, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man. There can be no doubt that from the beginning of the 19th century, ever since the time of the French Revolution, the psyche was moving more and more into the foreground of man's interest. The enthronement of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame seems to have been a symbolic gesture of great significance for the Western world, rather like the hewing down of Wotan's oak by Christian missionaries. It is certainly more than an amusing freak of history that just at the time of the Revolution, a Frenchman, Anquetil du Perron, should be living in India, and at the beginning of the 19th century brought back with him a translation of a collection of 50 Upanishads, simultaneously with this enthronement of the goddess of reason, which gave the West its first deep insight into the baffling mind of the East. To the historian, this is a mere coincidence, independent of the historical nexus of cause and effect. My medical bias prevents me from seeing it simply as an accident. Everything happened in accordance with a psychological law which is unfailingly valid in personal affairs. If anything of importance is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law, there arises a compensation in the unconscious. We may see in this an analogy to the conservation of energy in the physical world, for our psychic processes also have a quantitative, energetic aspect. No psychic value can disappear without being replaced by another of equivalent intensity. No psychic value can disappear without being replaced by another of equivalent intensity. This is a fundamental rule which is repeatedly verified in the daily practice of the psychotherapist and never fails. The doctor in me refuses point blank to consider the life of a people as something that does not conform to psychological law. And that quote comes from Civilization in Transition, Collected Works, Volume 10, paragraphs 174 and following. Here we have a glimpse of how Jung perceives the history of humanity as the history of one more patient. He says that as the spiritual value that had been carried in the vessel of Christianity was in the process of being so severely depreciated, the new version of that psychic value was being brought from the East. It is even significant that a Frenchman had to do it, since it was the French who were enthroning the goddess of reason. This historical archetypal event, the enthronement of the goddess of reason, is something that we see relived in the life of young individual This enthronement of the goddess of reason is something that we see relived in the life of the young individual again and again. We don't see it as much now as in earlier times because there are not so many people who have been exposed to a religious childhood, but there are still some. We see friends or patients who have gone through a religious childhood and at adolescence go through the French Revolution, in effect enthroning the goddess of reason in Notre Dame. This is an archetypal event which takes place individually as well as historically. Okay, so that's as much of what I was going to read from Dr. Edinger's book as I was planning to read. Let me just note that we currently have this orgy of the goddess of reason in the form of Dr. Jordan Peterson and his book of Logos, 12 Rules for Life, which is all Logos all the time. So the goddess of reason was definitely reading over Dr. Peterson's shoulder when he wrote that. Okay, so now I'm reading from Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung, published by Princeton University Press. Now, keep in mind, Dr. Jung in this book is discussing how the phenomenon of the self is the deepest archetype in the unconscious and in the collective unconscious as well. And it is also called the God image because human beings can't tell the difference between the self and the metaphysical God. And so in this case, Dr. Jung is talking about how, because of the events of history working up to the time of Nostradamus is then constellated and is able to make his prophecies. And in order to read this, since in the text are astrological signs, I have pulled off the internet this handy-dandy set of symbols of astrology, and these actually appear in the text. And keep in mind, if you listen to chapter 6, Dr. Jung was talking about the fact that over history, ancients didn't have astronomy and all the sciences that our modern mind has at our disposal. And so they were trying to explain things. And this development took place over 10,000 years or more, and they had essentially the same night sky as we have, and so they were attributing to the movement of the stars certain events. Well, if you do that over time, a long time, certain truths do emerge, and so anything that doesn't work falls away, but the things that do work come to the fore. And this is why astrology hasn't disappeared completely, because some things of it are quite uncanny. My easiest description of how that you can see that is by looking at the Chinese zodiac, and go to a Chinese restaurant someday where they have a placemat with the 12 types of year, and find your own year and see if it doesn't describe you. It happens that I was born in a dog year, and I have to say unequivocally that in many ways that describes me. And my wife, who was born in the year of the snake, also just says that it describes her. And so this is the way astrology works. Ideas that don't work for whatever reason, sometimes we can't explain them, but ideas that don't work fall away, but the things that do work come. And so anyway, so today I'm doing a behind-the-scenes reading, which means an unedited reading of Chapter 7 of Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. And I'm reading Chapter 7, The Prophecies of Nostradamus. You're free to make comments or ask questions as I proceed. I'm presuming everybody can hear me fine. Okay. Paragraph 150. The course of our religious history, as well as an essential part of our psychic development, could have been predicted more or less accurately, both as regards time and content, from the precession of the equinoxes through the constellation of Pisces. The prediction, as we saw, was actually made and coincides with the fact that the Church suffered a schism in the 16th century. After that, an enantiodromian process set in contrast to the... Okay, keep in mind the word enantiodromia is a word that Dr. Jung uses very often, and it means the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. And so in psychic energy, where you have opposites and the psychic energy is passing back and forth between the opposites, things will tend toward one side of a scale, and then by enantiodromia, by this tendency to turn into the opposite, they'll start moving back across the scale in another way. So let me read that sentence again. After that, an enantiodromian process set in which, in contrast to the Gothic strivings upwards to the heights, could be described as a horizontal movement outwards, namely the voyages of discovery and the conquest of nature. The vertical was cut across by the horizontal, and man's spiritual and moral development moved in a direction that grew more and more obviously anti-Christian, so that today we are confronted with the crisis of Western civilization, whose outcome appears to be exceedingly dubious. With this background in mind, I would like to mention the astrological prophecies of Nostradamus, written in a letter to Henry II of France on June 27, 1558, after detailing a year characterized, among other things, by Jupiter's conjunction in Mercury, with Mars squared in Mercury. Okay, I'm not an astrologer, so I don't really know what that means. I'm just trying to read the symbols here. So he put a footnote, so I'll read this footnote. According to the old tradition, the conjunction of Jupiter and Mercury, as mentioned above, is characteristic of Christianity. The quartile aspect between Mercury and Mars injures Mercury by martial violence. According to Cardin, Mercury conjoined with Mars signifies the law of Mohammed. This aspect could therefore indicate an attack by Islam. Al-Masar regards Jupiter conjoined with Mars in the same way, quote, "And if Mars shall be in conjunction with him, Jupiter, it signifies the fiery civilization and the pagan faith. On the analogy of history, the evil events to come are ascribed to the crescent moon, but one never reflects on the opponent of Christianity. But one never reflects that the opponent of Christianity dwells in the European unconscious. History repeats itself." Okay. Going on, he says, quote, "Then the beginning of the year shall see a greater persecution against the Christian Church than ever was in Africa, and it shall be in the year 1792, at which time everyone will think it a renovation of the age, And at that time and in those countries the infernal power shall rise against the church of Jesus Christ. This shall be the second Antichrist, which shall persecute the said church and its true vicar by means of the power of temporal kings, who through their ignorance shall be seduced by tongues more sharp than any sword in the hands of a madman. The persecution of the clergy shall have its beginning in the power of the northern kings, joined by the eastern ones, and that persecution shall last 11 years, or a little less, at which time the chief northern king shall fail. Paragraph 152. However, Nostradamus thinks that a united southern king will outlast the northern one by 3 years. He sees a return of paganism. Quote, the sanctuary destroyed by paganism, unquote. The Bible will be burned and an immense bloodbath will take place. So great tribulations as ever did happen since the first foundation of the Christian church. All Latin countries will be affected by it. Paragraph 153. There are historical determinants that may have moved Nostradamus to give the year 1792 as the beginning of the new Aion. For instance, Cardinal Pierre de Lay, basing himself on Albumasar, writes in his Concordantia on the 8th conjunctio maxima, Jupiter conjoined. I have to look at the. Okay, so he writes in his Concordantia, in the 8th conjunctio maxima, Jupiter conjoined with Saturn in Aries, which had been calculated for 1693. Quote, and after that shall be the fulfillment of 10 revolutions of Saturn in the year 1789, and this will happen after the said conjunction, in the course of 97 years or thereabouts. This being so, we say that if the world shall endure until then, which God alone knows, then there will be many and great and marvelous changes and transformations of the world, especially as concerns lawgiving and religious sects. For the said conjunction and the revolutions of Saturn will coincide with the revolution or reversal of the upper orb, i.e., the 8th sphere, and from these and other premises the change of sex will be known. The change of sex, that's S-E-C-T-S, not S-E-X. The change of sex will be known. Whence it may be concluded with some probability that this is the time when the Antichrist shall come with his law and his damnable sects, which are utterly contrary and inimical to the law of Christ. For being human, we can have no certainty with regard to the time and the moment of his coming. Yet despite the indeterminate statement that he will come at approximately that time, it is possible to have a probable conjecture and a credible hypothesis in accordance with the astronomical indications. If, therefore, the astronomers say that a change of sex will occur about that time, then according to them, a mighty one will come after Muhammad, who will set up an evil and magical law. Thus we may surmise with credible probability that after the sect of Muhammad none other will come save the law of the Antichrist. So I think what Dr. Jung is talking about here is self-fulfilling prophecy. So Nostradamus had written his prophecies in 1557, and I'm just looking, I don't have the date of these other books, but they were all pointing to a conjunction in the time frame 1789 to 1792. And so this would have been fairly widely known among men and women living at that time, and it would be passing through the collective unconscious as well, which means that it was rather prefiguring in the psyche the idea that there was going to be a cataclysmic change at the time of the French Revolution, so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so paragraph, at least that's how I interpret it, but you're welcome to your interpretation as well. Paragraph 154. In connection with the calculation of the year 1693, Pierre Daly quotes Albamasar as saying that the first conjunctio maxima of Saturn and Jupiter took place Anno Mundi 3200. To this, Albamasar added 960 years, which brings us to AD 1693 as the year of the 8th conjunctio maxima. In part 3 of his book, chapter 17, Pierre Daly criticizes this view and calls it a false deduction. In his treatise against superstition, quote, superstitiosus, in his treatise against superstitiosus astronomus, 1410, he maintains that the Christian religion should not be brought under astrological laws. He was alluding in particular to Roger Bacon, who had revived the theory that Christianity was under the influence of the planet Mercury. Pierre Daly held that only superstitions and heretical opinions were astrologically influenced. I'm going to spell this man's name. It's Pierre, Pierre, and then Daly, D''Ailly. I apologize for my poor French pronunciation. So Pierre Daly held that only superstitious and heretical opinions were astrologically influenced, and especially the coming of the Antichrist. Paragraph 155. We are probably right in assuming that these calculations were known to Nostradamus, who proposed 1792 as an improvement on 1789. Both dates are suggestive, and a knowledge of subsequent events confirms that the things that happened around that time were significant forerunners of developments in our own day. The enthronement of the Décès-Raison was in fact an anticipation of the anti-Christian trend that was pursued from then onwards. Paragraph 156. The, quote, renovation of the age, unquote, might mean a new Aion, and it coincides in a remarkable way with the new system of dating the revolutionary calendar, which began with September 22nd, 1792, and had a distinctly anti-Christian character. What had been brewing up long beforehand then became a manifest event. In the French Revolution, men witnessed the enantiodromia that had set in with the Renaissance and ran parallel with the astrological fish symbol. The time seemed a significant one astrologically for a variety of reasons. In the first place, this was the moment when the precession of the equinoxes reached the tail of the second fish. Then, in the year 1791, Saturn was in Aries, a fiery sign. Besides that, tradition made use of the theory of maximal conjunctions and regarded the year of the 8th conjunctio maxima, 1693, as a starting point for future calculations. This critical year was combined with another tradition basing itself on periods of 10 revolutions of Saturn, each period taking 300 years. Pierre Delisle cites Albumassar, who says in his Magnae Conjunctionis, "They said that the change shall come when 10 revolutions of Saturn have been completed, and that the permutation of Saturn is particularly appropriate to the movable signs." And the movable signs are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Okay, so, and that the permutation of Saturn is particularly appropriate to the movable signs Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. According to Pierre Delisle, a Saturn period came to an end in 11 BC, and he connects this with the appearance of Christ. Another period ended in AD 289. This connects with Manichaeism. The year 589 foretells Islam, and 1189 the significant reign of Pope Innocent III. 1489 announces a schism of the Church, and 1789 signalizes by inference the coming of the Antichrist. Fantasy could do the rest, for the archetype had long been ready and was only waiting for the time to be fulfilled. That a usurper from the north would seize power is easily understood when we consider that the Antichrist is something infernal, the devil or the devil's son, and is therefore Typhon or Seth, who has his fiery abode in the north. Typhon's power is triadic, possessing two confederates, one in the east and one in the south. This power corresponds to the lower triad. Paragraph 157. Paragraph 157. Nostradamus, the learned physician and astrologer, would certainly have been familiar with the idea of the north as the region of the devil, unbelievers, and all things evil. The idea, as St. Eucurius of Lyon, who died in 450, remarks, goes back to Jeremiah 1:14, quote, "From the north shall an evil wind break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land," unquote. And other passages such as Isaiah 14:12 and following, quote, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the assembly of the far north. Unquote. The Benedictine monk Rabanus Maurus, who died in 856, says that, quote, the north wind is the harshness of persecution, unquote, and, quote, a figure of the old enemy, unquote. The north wind, he adds, signifies the devil, as is evident from Job 26:7, quote, he stretcheth out the north over the empty space, and hangeth the earth upon nothing, unquote. Rabanus interprets this as meaning that God allows the devil to rule the minds of those who are empty of his grace, unquote. St. Augustine says, quote, who is that north wind, save him who said, I will set up my seat in the north. I will be like the Most High. The devil held rule over the wicked and possessed the nations, etc. Paragraph 158. The Victorine monk Garnerius says that the malign spirit was called Aquilo and the north wind. Its coldness meant the frigidity of sinners. Adam Scotus imagined there was a frightful dragon's head in the north, from which all evil comes. From its mouth and snout it emitted smoke of a triple nature, the threefold ignorance, namely of good and evil, of true and false, of fitting and unfitting. That is the smoke, says Adam Scotus, which the prophet Ezekiel in his vision of God saw coming from the north, the smoke of which Isaiah speaks. The pious author never stops to think how remarkable it is that the prophet's vision of God should be blown along on the wings of the north wind, wrapped in this devilish smoke of threefold ignorance. Where there is smoke, there is fire. Hence the great cloud had brightness round about it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming bronze. The north wind comes from the region of fire, and despite its coldness is a ventus urens, a burning wind, as Gregory the Great calls it, referring to Job 27:21. This wind is the malign spirit who rouses up the flames of lust in the heart and kindles every living thing to sin. Through the breath of evil incitement of earthly pleasures, he makes the hearts of the wicked to burn. As Jeremiah 1:13 says, I see a boiling pot facing away from the north. In these quotations from Gregory, we hear a faint echo of the ancient idea of the fire in the north, which is still very much alive in Ezekiel, whose cloud of fire appears from the north, whence an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. Unquote. Paragraph 159. In these circumstances, it is hardly Paragraph 159. In these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that Nostradamus warns against the usurper from the north when foretelling the coming of the Antichrist. Even before the Reformation, the Antichrist was a popular figure in folklore, as the numerous editions of the Antichrist in the second half of the 15th century show. This is quite understandable in view of the spiritual events then impending. the Reformation was about to begin, Luther was promptly greeted as the Antichrist, and it is possible that Nostradamus calls the Antichrist, who was to appear after 1792, the second Antichrist, because the first had already appeared in the guise of the German reformer, or much earlier with Nero or Mohammed. We should not omit to mention in this connection how much capital the Nazis made out of the idea that Hitler was continuing and completing the work of Reformation, which Luther had left only half finished. Paragraph 160. From the existing astrological data, therefore, and from the possibilities of interpreting them, it was not difficult for Nostradamus to predict the imminent enantiodromia of the Christian Aion. Indeed, by making this prediction, he placed himself firmly in the anti-Christian phase and served as its mouthpiece. Paragraph 161. After this excursion, let us turn back to our fish symbolism, which begins in chapter 8 with the historical significance of the fish symbol. Okay, so that's it. I've read the chapter on Nostradamus. I hope I seem to have had a few people who stayed with me, so I hope you enjoyed that reading, and that will be the end of my production for today. I will stick with you here one more minute or so to give you a chance to comment or ask any questions, and while I do that, I'll hold this astrology symbols up so that you can see them once again. So these are the symbols that actually appear in the middle of the text in Jung's text, and therefore makes it hard for a non-astrologer like me to read because I have to go back and interpret them. But in any case, so Dr. Jung, in this book, Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, is looking at the various ways in which the self archetype, which is the deepest archetype in the human unconscious, Dr. Jung also calls it the God image, or Dr. Edinger sometimes calls it the transpersonal self. And they talk about it as being indistinguishable from the metaphysical God, because human beings can't tell the difference between the metaphysical God and the self in the unconscious. And so this is why Nostradamus becomes important, because, as Dr. Edinger says, he's constellated the unconscious, and so he's feeling these ideas coming through him, and he feels their divine inspiration. And as many of you probably know, a couple weeks back, I had a similar experience, which I called the divine drama, and I read my response into the meeting that we held last Monday, not on Labor Day, but the Monday before Labor Day. And so it's 2 weeks ago this Monday. And so because I didn't give much time for discussion during that meeting, I will be allowing for discussion this Monday night at our meeting at 8 p.m. And it will be a live meeting with our local group. I've asked them to look through my dissertation here, which you may or may not have heard, but you can find on the YouTube channel. And some of them, one of them has made an interesting comment, which I won't tell you about now, but we'll talk about on Monday evening. So with that having been said, I'm going to terminate this session for tonight. Thank you for joining me.